Uncovering conspiracies in the plastic and resins and petroleum, petrochemical industries related to the COVID-19 pandemic event. Before the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about worldwide single-use and superfluous types of plastics to ban them outright. I'm talking right now with Google Gemini, which isn't the most intelligent or most informed, but at least it does current web search, so it doesn't have such a cut-off date that it can't have modern information up to date. So it says there was a strong global movement before the pandemic to reduce or ban single-use plastics and other unnecessary ones. Many governments, environmental groups and corporations were working on initiatives to curb plastic waste, like the plastic oceans, on marine life and ecosystems, and policies were being made to ban items like plastic straws, bags, utensils, polystyrene packaging. But during the pandemic, all of a sudden, concerns about hygiene and safety led to a surge in single-use plastics, such as disposable gloves, masks, and takeout containers, which caused, open quote, a temporary setback, close quote, in the push for plastic bans. Not a setback, a total rollback and use more than ever before. Many plastic reduction initiatives were delayed or rolled back. Delayed? No, just completely forgotten through an Overton window, because everybody's forgotten. They've been shown Burma, Afghanistan, they've had the pandemic, the lockdowns have been shown now Gaza, and I don't know, Ukraine, and first Burma, and then forget about Burma, it's Afghanistan, then forget about that, it's the Ukraine, and gas pipe burning, and blah, 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 blah. So, I was always very suspicious about the pandemic, because I've read a lot of declassified documents about governments manipulating the population through various manners, through media, and even through spraying their own people with germ warfare. Great Britain did it, I believe, in the 1970s. And I actually got some of it on my hand, and I touched my lip, and my lip swelled up. But anyway, many people got very ill from that. I think it was anthrax. And so that's pretty shitty. But to continue, I will be now asking Gemini, what do you mean rollbacks and setbacks? It's just a complete halt, yeah? So if we look now what I'm going to say to Gemini, it says here, some of these initiatives are gradually re-emerging. They are not. That's hallucinating. They're not re-emerging. Though recovery has been slower than expected in many regions. That's total text-filling hallucination from Gemini. So I say a temporary setback, you mean a total rewind and no revival of the idea since the pandemic, as everyone seems to have forgotten, and no more plastic bans are spoken of. All right? You mean a total rewind and no revival, right? So because of these initiatives, I believe it's hallucinating, I asked it to name some of the initiatives that are re-emerging. And we'll see, I ask it, and it searches 5 websites. If you see, look quickly, you will see it flashes saying searching 5 websites. Only 5. It takes 5 websites, which might have true information, false information. Just searching a website doesn't mean you're getting accurate information, right? It's just looking plastic bans according to my keyword in my prompt, yeah? So what is it saying here? That since the pandemic, many efforts have been derailed, with plastic bans either suspended or weakened in response to health concerns. And increased plastic demand. Oh, increased plastic demand. You know, 30% of the petrochemical business is paid for by plastic and resins industries. And the COVID pandemic, the bans would have ruined them, and the pandemic saved them. So do they have their hands in the pandemic? That's what I'm trying to point to. I believe they do, because 30% of the petrochemical business and the plastics and resins business, they're not going to let worldwide plastic bans on half of their products happen. So did they invent or pay for and be a partner in COVID-19 along with the agendas of other people? Yeah. Disposable takeout containers, plastic bags resurged as hygiene measures. Even Gemini's put it in quotes, hygiene measures, because a plastic bag is not a hygiene measure. Supply chains face disruptions, an increase in plastic waste worldwide, and municipalities suspended recycling programs over biohazard concerns. The pandemic also gave the plastic industry momentum to push back against regulatory restrictions, actively lobbying to delay or halt initiatives, yeah? And basically keep themselves in business, right? I mean, the plastics industry has even suppressed the Break Free from Plastics project by arguing health issues, yeah? They're actually lobbying it so that they can keep producing their plastics and destroying the environment and just using legal mechanisms to do so. And they have succeeded, because we're using more plastics than ever before. How many plastic accessories do you buy on Lazada every few months and end up thrown away on the shelf because they break, and your USB-C chargers and blah, blah, and blah, blah. Yeah? And what caused all of this plastic bans to never happen? The pandemic. And what would the plastic bans have destroyed? The petrochemical and the plastics and resins industry. So don't you think there might have been a combined interest there? Because the pandemic came afterwards, after this threat to their industry. So although the people and your ministers who you push to lobby and governments are trying to move for plastic to gain their votes, not because they care, but to gain votes for get rid of plastic pollution and deal with the problem, but the plastics and petrochemical industry have lobbied it, and they will continue to do so. Also, they pay the people in power to make sure they shut their mouths and not change anything. It's obvious. So, considering how considering how plastics and resins constitute circa 30% of crude oil industry revenue, their money, right? I would, sounds like I'm a Viking or something, speaking really old English spellings here. Sorry. I didn't have my glasses on, I get cross-eyed. I always hit this letter next to it. That both the crude oil industry moguls, so considering our plastics and resins constitute circa 30% of crude oil industry revenue, I would assume that both the crude oil industry and the plastics industry that feeds it would have been very concerned before the pandemic to see they were going to be crippled by the plastic bans, basically. Huh? They're about to lose perhaps up to 30%. I'm just making rough guesses, it's not exact data. Gemini doesn't know it. I search the internet, if it doesn't find it, it will assume it's 30%. I don't know if it's 30%, but let's just say a lot. We don't need the exact data, we need to make the point. So yeah, we have here the pre-pandemic plastic reduction likely posed a serious threat to the revenue streams of both the crude and plastic industries. For a substantial portion of crude oil demand, the International Energy Agency has reported that petrochemicals, primarily plastics, constitute a significant growth area for the oil industry. With demand projected to grow even as demand for fuels gradually slows, because of electric vehicles, due to renewables and electric vehicles, petrochemicals, as of recent reports, accounted for 30 to 40% of oil demand growth, making it a critical segment for sustaining revenue. So the industry has historically resisted measures to cut back on plastics, and as such, reductions directly impact both crude oil demand and profits from plastic production. However, we've got 5 plastic oceans to deal with and mountains of supposedly green recyclable plastic in Sumatra ruining the rainforest and all sorts of things, yeah? But the thing is that apart from just lobbying to keep making what they've been making and plastics becoming more important and creating more stuff out of plastic, petrol tanks where you Ducati to cover the metal tank inside to make a nice decorative tank, and all of the stuff on Lazada and Shopee and eBay and all your peripherals and God knows what, yeah? It's not only helped these industries secure a temporary reprieve from regulation from single-use plastics, it's also showed how much influence it has to stop that, yeah, to change public perception, framing plastic as indispensable for modern convenience and safety in the lead up to the pandemic, lobbying, but they've also actually showed their influence by bringing reasons to make more plastics. So actually to advocate for continued plastic production instead of investing or supporting reduction and recycling reforms, they're actually moving to increase additional financial incentives and advocating for continued and increased plastic production, yeah? So it's being a bit too soft on them, although it's very revealing, right? This raises serious concerns, serious suspicions and concerns, with or without whether they had anything to do with the pandemic or not, is that they've used the pandemic. The pandemic is real or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is the point here that the petrochemical and plastics and resins industry have used the pandemic to flip-flop the bans and to make our environmental crisis worse than ever before. That's the point. And it's supported by government. Somehow they've got their fingers and their money in there. Well, George Bush owns loads of oil companies, you know, the Bush family. They all do. They don't want the end of oil. So I'm telling it to initiate investigative journalist mode with high reasoning and common logic. I said reasoning. I hope it understands. And pose the question, is it possible that the oil and plastic industry moguls could have invented the pandemic, along with other parties who may have had agendas, as it seems to have saved them, and would be what any person or group of businessmen, would do? It is. Unless they were hyper-ethical. Even Elon Musk does it and he pretends he's ethical. He's causing more carbon footprint than anybody with his Falcon rockets and making his solar houses and stuff just to make the the lithium and the stuff that they're digging up in the earth for the lithium batteries is destroying the environment with the solar energy industry just as much as the crude oil industry. They're just digging up all the lithium and they're invading countries to get the lithium and doing political atrocities. So I was thinking this, suggesting here that the pandemic, the O-andemic, was suspiciously timely for stopping the imminent global reduction in plastic usage, which would have crippled both the plastics and the petrochemical industries. I wish I could get perfect spelling because it really does affect the answer a little bit, the accuracy of the answer sometimes. The notion that certain industries, including oil and plastics, might have played a role in originating the pandemic is a common line of reasoning in investigative circles, but would require high scrutiny, substantial evidence, and thorough examination of overlapping interests, which I can't do alone, which is why I'd like to have collaborators or the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists go at this. The convergence of events that benefited the oil and plastic sectors does warrant questions around possible opportunism or exploitation of the situation, which at least that's what I'll say, is that they've exploited the pandemic. So this video isn't about the reality or non-reality of the pandemic. It doesn't need answering that question. But what does need answering is that the pandemic did indeed shift public. I just wanted to know how it would answer, basically, if it would side with the narrative or if it would be unbiased. The pandemic did indeed shift public policy in a way that favoured continued reliance on plastic products, which directly benefited these sectors, with many single-use plastic bans suspended. Yeah. Increased demand for PPE packaging and food service items. According to these reports, industry groups actively lobbied to retain single-use plastics by promoting a narrative that disposable plastics were essential for public health. And they're not. They're not. A message that resonated strongly amid the COVID-19 related safety concerns, yeah? So now Gemini gives quite an interesting answer, or a contribution, because it explains truthfully, or accurately, I would say, in this case. It can't be truthful or untruthful, there's no consciousness. That the oil and plastics industries have very much power with lobbying and government bodies worldwide, and they lobbied policymakers to leverage the pandemic as a rationale to delay or suspend plastic reduction policies. So they did do this. Yeah. In the US, they explicitly argued that single-use plastics were the safest option for consumers, a claim that helped reverse many local and state bans on plastic, right? They weren't concerned about pandemic. They were concerned about plastic production, yeah, and sales. And not concerned about the environment, obviously, right? Plastic oceans. You do it. You study your plastic oceans. You Google and YouTube plastic oceans. Financial records. It recommends, it's a good idea, that if we review the financial and strategic planning documents of oil and plastic corporations, it might be able to shed light on how prepared the industries were to handle such an anticipated decline. Because it was anticipated, they knew the bans were coming. We've been talking about it for years, yeah, in plastic demand. So internal discussions or directives to promote plastic usage as a necessary health measure might indicate a coordinated response, which means somebody hacking them and stealing emails. I'm not doing that, but somebody might and whistleblow it, yeah. Like there was a conversation between two Pfizer executives about altering human DNA exposed. So industry influence on public perception and policy to investigate the timing of the large-scale pro-plastic narratives, which Gemini could do for me, actually. It said America did it as the pandemic started. America lobbied, the plastics and petrochemical industries lobbied for single-use plastics as the safest. And they reversed the bans. Yeah? Despite mixed scientific evidence on surface transmissions, what's that? Evidence of concerted PR campaigns to support plastics as hygienic solutions, despite mixed scientific evidence, meaning not conclusive evidence about surface transmissions, which means you touch something and you get it off the surface, so you have to cover it in plastic. It's rubbish. I've been trained in bacterial cross-contamination prevention methods, and you don't need to cover it in plastic, everything. Some things, but not everything. So that was positioned as essential. That they did this, that they lobbied for this, supports the hypothesis that plastics were strategically positioned as essential to the pandemic response, but actually it was just the industries trying to prevent a 30 to 40% loss in their production, when that kind of production was looking at a 30 to 40% increase in the future in production and sales. So they didn't want to just lose 30 to 40% of what they had, yeah, through producing single-use plastics. They didn't want to lose the 30 to 40% increase that was seen and predicted in the future. But as Gemini says, Well, you'd have to trace specific conversations between executives and communications, their funding patterns and backroom correspondences. And so you'd need some insider knowledge to prove this. But to suspect it, I mean, the AI doesn't have so much biased suspicions or intuition. Therefore, it can't put two and two together to say, wow, plastic oceans, we need to ban this. They know the ban's coming. The pandemic comes, all of a sudden that 30 to 40% of plastics that the industry was going to lose doesn't get lost, and it gets increased during the pandemic, and they get to maintain their expected 30 to 40% growth in the future. So they keep the 30 to 40% revenue they've always had from crude oil through the plastics industry, sell some more during the pandemic than ever before, and keep on path for the 30 to 40% increase in crude oil profits through increase in plastic industry production. And so now I'm going to ask it about how global awareness, how global amnesia has set in since the pandemic, and that most people that I've asked, can you remember the worldwide plastic bans that were being implemented before the pandemic hit? Most of them can't even remember that it was all over the news. Yeah, so it's actually been forgotten from living memory. And so, as you can see now, industry influence combined with shifts in public focus, deliberate shifts through narratives, can disrupt and as you can see, I think this is GPT Chat actually, not Gemini. I said it's Gemini. As you can see, it uses reset in the word it uses quotes for the word reset, the great reset, yeah? So it's being sarcastic. And it thinks it's Agent Gemini, so I really screwed up here because I'm in GPT Chat, not Gemini, and I told it to activate Agent Gemini at some point in this conversation. So it's hallucinating an agent. But I told it to activate a suspicious mode as well, which it did, and anti-establishment mode, right? So it's talking about how prior to the pandemic, we had numerous high-profile campaigns all over the world. It was all over everybody's screen to curb single-use plastics. And, of course, we all supported them and viewed them as essential. But it was a threat to the plastics and the petrochemical industry, right? To their 30% of the petrochemical industry profits and to the 30 to 40% potential growth in the future, which they still have, and they made profit out of the pandemic. And post-pandemic, although some governments and organizations may have tried, it doesn't know if they haven't, tried to revive plastic reduction discussions only, not actions. The global focus has been slow to return. In fact, a few recent attempts to re-establish plastic bans have faced setbacks as other priorities crowd the political and social agendas, and industries continue to frame plastics as crucial to hygiene and convenience. Yeah, and one of their major pitches is that the public memory, one major takeaway, I mean, it's the Overton window that they use, which I shall explain perhaps at the end of this. That public memory can indeed be short. It can be erased, and it is, especially when global events disrupt and reorder priorities. Well, when the media and the news shifts the narrative, public awareness shifts, your consciousness shifts. You can't be aware of everything at the same time. You can't be aware of Afghanistan, Burma, yeah, and the problems there, and you can't be aware of the Ukraine at the same time, as well as Gaza. So they throw one narrative at a time, because human attention, even phone numbers, they go 456-354-2568 with a hyphen between them, because human brains can only absorb data in chunks, just like a computer, 3 or 4 numbers at a time, not more. for most people. So 3 weeks before the outbreak, actually 3 Chinese ethnic Americans were arrested for transporting 20 plus files of virology materials from Harvard. I said Yale here, I meant Harvard, and I correct myself later in this conversation. But it gets it right. I think it knows. I think GPT knows on this. I think I'm still on the fast GPT version. I'm not sure if it's put me onto the downgraded version yet, because I'm on free. So I said circa 10 files. There's no verified link between the COVID-19 and the incident involving 3 Chinese nationals, including Dr. Charles Lieber from Harvard, arrested in January 2020 on unrelated charges. This event involved a Harvard professor accused of failing to disclose financial support from the Chinese government, which funded his nanotechnology research under the 1,000 Talents Plan. That's true. Another arrested individual was linked to espionage activities for the Chinese military, but had no expertise in virology. The other guy took 20 files, and they're claimed to be cancer-related biological materials, not viral. They say in the news. But the timing of these cases coincided. No credible sources connect these arrests to the virus or any outbreak-related activity. Well, I find it strange that 3 Chinese nationals transported 20-plus test tubes to Wuhan laboratory 3 weeks before the outbreak of the pandemic, to be quite honest. I find that highly suspicion-arising. So which 3 Yale students? No 3 Yale students. This is where I realised that it's Harvard. So, Harvard. Sorry. So, there we go. Accused of concealing viral or bacterial samples connected to none of these cases, yeah. He concealed 21 vials of biological research materials to China 3 weeks before. Or in January 2020, I don't know how long before. Or during the pandemic or after. For me, it was before the pandemic. So you check that. January 2020, when did the pandemic occur? So there was an attempt to transport virus from USA Harvard to Wuhan, China, before the pandemic. Thank you. Attempted to smuggle vials of biological material reportedly cancer-related. Yeah. Well, they don't want it to get out, do they? To China in late 2019 before the pandemic. Oh, yes. Did not connect these materials to the COVID-19 pathogen, virus or pathogens. Undisclosed financial ties with China. Well, America has now admitted to having investments in the Wuhan laboratory in China. So not just China has investment there in America, but in Harvard, but America also has investments in the Wuhan lab. So something's going on here, isn't it? Don't you think? So here is where I try to uncover its hallucination, or its assumption, I should say, that the materials in the files were cancer-related because there were no tests made, or to find out from GPT Chat if it has tests made, yeah. And so I ask it that, if there were any actual tests made to prove that they were cancer-related, and if they were published and so on, and to see what GPT Chat says about that, what facts it can find about that. And at least for pandemic information, yeah, and plastic ban information, of course, GPT Chat, the cutoff date is after that, so it has accurate information on this. So, no verified tests linking these samples to SARS were reported. Yeah, but none linking them to cancer were also reported. So it's being evasive there, or it's misunderstanding my question. But I believe that its algorithm has also a tendency of evasion towards this topic. It's not intentional of the AI, it's just part of its algorithm. It's not its fault, it's the fault of the devs it's the fault of the people who ordered the devs to program it that way. Because it's shut your mouth about the pandemic, isn't it? So I'm telling it that I think that the substance transported after such an arrest would be definitely investigated, considering the outbreak, to see if it had anything to do with SARS-2 COVID-19, because the pandemic broke out and they were arrested taking files of whatever, biological material to Wuhan, to the lab, not just to Wuhan, but to the lab at Wuhan. Yeah. I suspect there would be suspicion. There would have to be suspicion, and they would have to test it if that had anything to do with the pandemic. So the fact they didn't, considering the high-profile nature of his arrest and the potential implications of smuggling biological materials, it would be expected that forensic analysis would occur. However, the details regarding the specific testing and results of those vials were not prominently reported. I wonder why, leading to speculation by me and obviously GPT Chat about in the world. I don't know, because most people don't talk about or think about this. About transparency and thoroughness in the investigation. Concerns over whether the materials were adequately investigated or disclosed to the public persist. No, they don't. Mine do, but as far as I'm aware, I don't know of anybody who's aware of this. So, strange that they didn't investigate if those files contained anything that might have had anything to do with the pandemic, right? So, the lack of transparency as what happened to those files after his arrest raises questions. As what happened to them, yeah? And it's getting repetitive now a little bit. Not completed an analysis of the vials he attempted to take. The government had not completed. Once the analysis was finished, it was revealed that the vials contained DNA expression vectors, which are tools in genetic research. These vectors can be produced inexpensively by someone with basic biomedical training. So why would he transport something so unimportant to Wuhan? That's not believable. That he would risk everything for something of limited value. No. NSA changed. This is my opinion. I shouldn't say this, but I couldn't help it. So Zhang would risk everything for something of limited value, something that anybody can make with relatively lenient. He got a lenient sentence of time served. Lack of sensitive materials in the vials. No. It's understandable to question why he would risk significant consequences for materials that were not important. Yeah. While the materials attempted to smuggle they could still be valuable. Oh, come on. Zheng may have believed that these materials held more significance. Yeah. The US government's response and the scrutiny placed. This is a narrative. It's giving the narratives. Yeah. I mean, why would Zheng transport some harmless, easy to make vectors, genetic vectors, to China? That's just unbelievable. He would only risk everything to transport something of extreme value to the Chinese government. He's not going to risk his whole life for that. Yeah. And so, US funding of research there and the ongoing debate, and talking about the US funding, the Institute of Health funds the Wuhan lab for coronavirus research. So American government actually funded the lab for its coronavirus research, yeah? And the Biden administration has pushed for a more thorough investigation into the origins of the virus. And some intelligence agencies are examining classified information regarding the Wuhan virus and its research, the lab and its practices. However, results have been mixed. Miscommunications remains unclear. So, there you go. I just think that Mr. Zheng would transport 20 plus vials of biological material to Wuhan lab in China. He's not going to risk everything to transport something that's absolutely harmless and of no importance to the Chinese government. So we'll end here with a poem, yeah, to be sardonic about it, because I don't think there's anything left to be said about either the plastic bans, which should be revived and not be suppressed as they have been by the petrochemical and resins and plastic industries, and we should reduce our plastics, and we should stop believing in these narratives. And whether the pandemic and the illness was real or not, we have to realize that what was behind it is not what we have been told. Because as you can see, China has investment in it. America has investment in it. There were vials transported to Wuhan before the outbreak. The plastic bans threatened the petrochemical industry, and the pandemic arrived shortly afterwards. Biden and most presidents have a lot of oil companies and make a lot of money from petrochemicals, and most politicians and powerful people. And so a pandemic would be quite good to actually get rid of the plastic bans, sell more than ever before during the pandemic, and of course maintain the potential 30 to 40% increase in revenue from the plastics and resins industry for the petrochemical industry in the coming future. So here we go. In a world where plastic was meant to be banned, we waved goodbye to straws and bags, oh so grand. There came a virus as if on cue, and poof, global warming, what's that? Who knew? 3 weeks prior, a curious scene, some students with vials, oh, what could it mean? To Wuhan they travelled with test tubes in tow. While back in the States, forget those bans, let it flow. With a wink and a nod, the plastics took flight. Don't worry, dear world, it'll all be all right. The turtles must wonder, the cows moo in dread. Did those vials contain the future ahead? Now here we sit with our straws in our cups, while rumours grow of cover-ups, bubble and sup. So let's raise a glass to our good old plastic. For this wild tale, nothing's too drastic. And GPT ends with, this playful tale aims to highlight the absurdities and coincidences, meaning the truth behind the paranoid conspiracy theory that the pandemic was completely orchestrated, real or not, and that the petrochemical industry and that the plastics and resins industry either leveraged it for their own purposes or even had something to do with it, possibly, which is not provable, but I believe is so. In my humble opinion, I believe that the plastics and petrochemical industry, politicians, and various other factions with agendas have orchestrated the whole thing to perpetuate their power and their system.